Ag Bioscience, the #1 ag tech podcast globally, is now available on video. Hear from leaders and innovators across food, animal health, plant science, ag tech, and agriculture. Mondays at 6 a.m. on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, subscribe and leave us a review. It's the Ag Bioscience Podcast with Agronovis Indiana. Get more information at agronovisindiana.com.
I'm a man of faith. I mean, my life is not my own, but I don't see returning to active politics. I love that Luke Combs song that says, I think I rode that rocket about as far as it'll fly.
And how we rode that rocket as far as it could fly. Yeah, when somebody someday, well down the line, says, tell me something you're proud of when you think about your life.
He might be done with politics for now, but Columbus, Indiana's native son, Mike Pence, is far from finished with his push for conservative principles and policies. He talks about his new book, The Importance of Civility in Politics, and his time in the White House with President Trump. One-on-one with former U.S. Congressman, Indiana Governor, and the 48th Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, on this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. And I am very pleased to be joined on the podcast this week by a former Indiana governor and the 48th Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. And Mike, really great to be able to catch up with you and for you to take time to join us on the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, Gary. Thanks for having me on, and just congratulations on the widening influence of all of your business platforms. I've known you a long time, but you've become an indispensable voice for growth and opportunity in Indiana, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
I appreciate those kind words. You are, as always, very busy, in particular promoting your new book, What Conservatives Believe, Rediscovering the Conservative Conscience. I've got to ask you, you hear people doing book tours all the time. Is that a grind to get out there on the road? And you're getting these same questions over and over again and ping-ponging around the place. What's it like?
Yeah. Actually, it's a privilege for me to be out and about. We started in New York City, series of events, and then flew to Los Angeles and spent a fair amount of time in Texas. We round out this week in Chicago. But the great part was my wife is a Zen master, Gary, at working in family stops. And with a daughter with a Navy husband stationed on the West Coast, we stole a weekend with the grandkids. And so it still was included a respite, but it's been a privilege, and I've been really very humbled by the response to the book, the attention that it's received. My hope is, in writing What Conservatives Believe, is that we'd start a conversation about some of the changes that have been happening on both sides of the aisle as we go into the midterm elections, but maybe even more significantly as we go into the next presidential election. I keep telling my fellow conservatives, it's important that we focus on what we're for before we focus on who we're for.
Yeah, you kind of answered it there, but what really motivated you to write this book at this moment in time, at this moment in really American politics?
Yeah, well, for decades, really back to the 1970s, the Republican Party has been defined by a commitment to a traditional conservative agenda of strong national defense, American leadership in the world, less government, less taxes, traditional moral values. And really, our contest politically was always against a traditional liberal democratic party, but there have been changes literally on both sides of the aisle that I think I try and cover in the book. First, the Democratic Party has been, in many ways, overtaken by the progressive left, even the embrace of socialism and the economic policies of the failed past of the 20th century. I remember when my friend Bernie Sanders was in the House with me, and I would always say we got along fine. I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. But I would often tell people Bernie Sanders is the nicest socialist I ever met. But now Bernie Sanders really kind of won over his political party, and I think that's noteworthy. But on the Republican side of the aisle, in my book, I also point out that there's a new threat to that traditional conservative agenda, and that is the rise of the populist right that embraces protectionism, isolationism, marginalizes values. And while the new Trump administration, Gary, I hasten to say, has gotten a lot right. I mean, extending those tax cuts, securing the border, supporting the military, standing with Israel, taking the fight directly to Iran. But I don't need to tell you or your listeners that some of the economic policies, broad-based tariffs on friend and foe alike, that were turned back by the Supreme Court, price controls on pharmaceuticals and credit cards, nationalization of American businesses. Add to that the stops and starts on our support for Ukraine after that brutal and unprovoked invasion by Russia. And I see the influence of the populist right. And I also think for many Americans today, they're confused about what it means to be a conservative. And that's why I wrote this book, to lay out the traditional framework and beliefs of conservatives, not just here in Indiana, but across the country.
Is the Republican Party still conservative?
That's such a great question. I believe it is. In fact, I end the book, which was largely inspired by Barry Goldwater's classic book, Conscience of a Conservative. I've actually got the copy of that book that I received back maybe 30 years ago, right here in my office, Gary. In fact, in many ways, even the title of the book, Rediscovering the Conservative Conscience, is a nod to him. Barry Goldwater starts his book by saying this is essentially a conservative country. I end the book by saying I believe that's still true. I think by that I mean Americans, as I've traveled the country pretty relentlessly, including after I left office, made home back here in Indiana. Americans really believe in that government ought to live within its means. They see us as leader of the free world. They believe in the values of faith and the priority that we put on family. And so I think in the main, the American people still embrace those principles. But with both parties being influenced in different directions, I thought the time had come for a book like What Conservatives Believe.
Yeah, I got to ask you too about the climate and the extremes and with social media and the conversation or lack of conversation on important issues. A lot of people have said, "Oh, the pendulum is going to swing, so far one way and come back to some normalcy." As you look at the public debate on issues like we're talking about here today, where do you see things now, and where do you see things going?
Well, I think democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. You and I have known each other long enough to know that those were lessons that I didn't learn early in life. I got caught up in some pretty serious negative campaigning in my first few tries for Congress. But when I was elected at the age of 40, Karen and I felt compelled first by our Christian faith to live out the golden rule in the way that we carried ourselves in public life. And, I really do believe that the American people long for us to restore a threshold of civility in public life. It's been coarsened, no doubt, on both sides of the aisle. Social media hasn't helped that with its anonymity and the ability for people to fire barbs. But I trust the American people. They're going to set things right because, as I talk about in the book, we've got some real challenges facing this country that are going to require us to be able to work together. $40 trillion national debt is not going to be resolved unless we create the conditions of good faith and goodwill between the political parties. And frankly, the rise of China, which I think is the greatest economic and strategic threat facing the United States, it is going to have to be met by all Americans and Republicans and Democrats, creating the conditions where we can work together and support our military, promote economic policies that will see to it that this is another American century.
Younger voters these days are very concerned about things like housing affordability, healthcare, student debt, those types of things. How do you kind of square those issues with the limited government conservative principles you're talking about?
Yeah, it's such a great point because the answer that people are going to, frankly, in the populist right and on the progressive left, are government solutions. The housing bill that just passed the Congress and was signed into law was originally written by Elizabeth Warren, and in my judgment, represents an immense intrusion into free market, the ability of investors to buy residential homes. I think I really did write this book with the rising generation in mind to make the case for economic freedom. That the truth is that while it's tempting to think that government can solve the affordability problem, as Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said years ago, the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money. And the truth is, I really do believe less taxes, less regulation, more affordable American energy, educational choice and opportunities like we've led here in Indiana, all are a foundation for the kind of boundless prosperity the American people have enjoyed in the past and will in the future. But we got to make the case to the young people in this country, and that's a lot why I wrote this book.
Mentioned Indiana. You served, of course, in Congress as governor and then ultimately vice president. Of those experiences, what lessons from Indiana most shaped your really your understanding of conservative governing?
Well, it just that freedom and fiscal responsibility works. I mean, I saw where the Bears just made the announcement about moving to Hammond. I was talking to a couple of leaders at the General Assembly this week about it, and they said, "Hey, bottom line, Indiana is a magnet, and has been for a while from Chicago because less taxes, a pro-business environment, economic freedom really works, and we've seen the state prosper and grow in that regard." I really do think you'd have to ask him why he tapped me in 2016. But I always had the impression that Indiana had a lot to do with it. I think he had a lot of respect for my conservative principles and my values. But the candidate, Donald Trump, during our campaign in 2016 was constantly peppering me with, "How did you do that in Indiana? How did you balance budgets? How did you create, the business environment you've done?" So it really did, one of a handful of states with a AAA bond rating. It really did inform, my service at the national level, and I think it gave me a lot of credibility going forward. I wish we'd done more in a couple of areas. I thought those tax cuts were terrific, rolling back red tape, unleashing American energy. But to be candid, we should have done more and still should do more to reform these entitlement programs that represent 85% of federal spending and are driving a debt that really threatens our economic future for our kids.
As you look at the things you're talking about, limited government, concerns about deficits, the debt, tax cuts, deregulation, those types of things you're talking about on a national level, but really are things that, in your view, I think you're saying has done Indiana well. That mindset has it positioned Indiana in a good space.
Well, it just really has. I mean, you know that objectively, but maybe the fact that I got to serve the other 49 states and got to travel a lot. From when I got on the national stage, really during that campaign in 2016, Indiana came up more times than I could possibly remember, with people saying, "Man, you guys have been on," whether it be balanced budgets, tax cuts, and education innovation. And I also say healthcare innovation. The Healthy Indiana plan that was launched by my predecessor, Mitch Daniels, but that we expanded to some 40,000 Hoosiers around the state, that was built on the principles of personal responsibility and health savings accounts. And I literally was just in Texas yesterday, and a legislator there came to me and said, "I think Indiana still has the model for Medicaid reform. We have a reputation, but I will tell you on a personal level, I'm awfully glad that I had the experience and the privilege of being governor of our great state before I served in the role as vice president. There's just so much more you learn when you're a CEO, you build a great business and it continues to grow, Gary. But there's something you learn when you're sitting where the buck stops. And I think at the end of the day, it also better equipped me to serve alongside.
Yeah,
Donald
I
Trump.
wanted to ask you about that and how your time as governor helped to shape you and your role from a leadership standpoint and otherwise as vice president.
Well, it just really did. Look, when I was a congressman, um, I would always joke that I always saw seriously. I would say, look, as a congressman, I didn't do wet finger in the wind. I just tried to vote the way I told people in Eastern Indiana I'd vote if I ever got there. Gary, we've known each other a long time. As I said, it took me 12 years to get to Congress. So I just tried to build a record that was consistent with my principles and, let the cards fall where they may. But I used to joke that when you're in Congress, you just have to get up every day and be right about your opinion.
Right. Yeah. Right.
When you're a governor, you have to choose the most right path.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get it pretty right, sometimes you don't. And it's a humbling process. It was a learning process. My late father, sometimes when I'd get outside the lines and have some disappointments in my life, my dad would put his hand on my shoulder and say, "Good learning experience." I had a few of those as governor of Indiana,
Yeah.
Uh, but so there was that. I better appreciated the weight and the of decision making that was on the president because I'd borne that in Indiana. But the other part was I had a lieutenant governor who was elected on the very same line, and there were two distinguished Hoosiers who served alongside me. One of whom went on to be governor, another whom went on to lead the state's largest community college system with enormous distinction. But just having someone in that role, I think, helped shape what I believe is the executive's expectation in that unique relationship. And I always tell people, I'm very proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration, what we did on the economy, what we did for security, what we did for values and the rule of law. Didn't end the way I wanted it to, as history records, but I'll always believe by God's grace, we did our duty on those fateful days at the end. But none of that takes away from the fact that all those 4.5 years, with that exception, President Trump and I had a strong, close, successful working relationship. And I think my days as governor informed that a lot.
Yeah. How would you describe your relationship with President Trump today?
I had the opportunity to congratulate the president and the first lady on their reelection, and it was a warm exchange. I could tell both of them were moved by it. And look, I love our country, and I want the president to be successful. I pray for him often. And as I say, we don't talk as often as we used to, which was every day throughout the day for 4 years. But I still get the distinct impression that he listens to me. And so part of why I wrote this book is I'm hoping to continue to maybe be that reminder to him of of all the millions of conservative voters that carried us to the White House. And I think we're responsible for carrying him back in 2024.
Yeah, I got to ask you before we go to break. What was it? What was it like serving in the Trump White House? You mentioned, that day-to-day interaction, the cabinet meetings, all the things that went on there. Probably an unfair question one single question to ask you to describe it. But how would you, as you reflect back on that now, how would you describe it?
One of our founders, and we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. Alexander Hamilton was in that founding generation. And when they got around to crafting the Constitution in 1787, he said that the Constitution contemplates a, quote, energetic executive. That would be a promise made, promise kept in Trump-Pence years. I can tell you it was constant energy, constant motion, constant moving forward. And as I said, we a lot of times through a hailstorm of criticism by the Democrat Party and also by their allies in the media. But that record we created, that growing economy, Gary, I don't have to tell you, you track it better than anybody else. Before that pandemic hit, we had an economy that was literally, raging, wages rising at the fastest pace. Unemployment for African Americans and Hispanic Americans was the lowest ever recorded. Women's unemployment was at a 50-year high. I'm proud of the record, but it came from an energetic leader that I was really privileged to serve.
Yeah, one more before we go to break, and that's the economy today. As you look at the economy, and a lot of people who suggest that once the war is solved, that the economy is ready to really take up. What's your take? What's your take on where things are now from an economic standpoint?
I think, looking between the lines with the inflation numbers that came out this week, and while we did get a good jobs number, I'm informed that once you take out the government jobs and government-supported jobs, it's not that dramatic. I think we're still feeling the hangover in the economy of those broad-based tariffs on friend and foe alike. Look, the thing I know from Indiana is that trade means jobs. What we make, what we grow, we sell to the world. And during the Trump-Pence years, we used tariffs and the threat of tariffs to open markets. But that was different on Liberation Day. This was a new policy, a new industrial policy. My foundation in Washington, D.C. was one of the folks making the case supporting the constitutional challenge to those tariffs in the Supreme Court. I'm pleased they turned them back on constitutional grounds. But I do believe that the administration would be wise to put their aspirations for more unilateral tariffs behind them. Let's be tough on our trading partners. Let's demand that they have reciprocal trading agreements with us. But let's let freedom and free trade and free markets work.
Much more ahead with former Indiana Governor and Vice President Mike Pence when the Business and Beyond podcast returns. Stay with us.
As a bank, PNC prides itself on being boring. But the truth is they couldn't be more excited to serve the dynamic Indianapolis community. For nearly 160 years, they've quietly toiled away to deliver brilliant results for their equally brilliant clients. They have dedicated PNC teams throughout the local area all ready to do the boring work to help you unlock your own brilliance. PNC Bank, brilliantly boring since 1865. PNC Bank, National Association member FDIC.
We build Indiana. The Laborers International Union of North America builds and maintains roads, bridges, and other essential infrastructure that make us the crossroads of America. So thanks to LIUNA members' work, Hoosiers have a better quality of life, like access to utilities, easier routes to jobs, schools, or medical care, and deliveries keep moving. We build Indiana for good jobs and stronger communities. The Laborers International Union of North America. We are LIUNA.
And welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week, really pleased to have with us Mike Pence, former Indiana governor, and of course, the 48th Vice President of the United States. And Mike, as we look at your book, which is out now, you're crisscrossing the country promoting that book, What Conservatives Believe, Rediscovering the Conservative Conscience. In the book, January 6th is mentioned, but really not in great detail. Was that a deliberate choice to kind of move that focus from that day itself to what you believe in terms of conservatism, what it should look like going forward?
Yeah, this is really a book about the future. Although I do have a chapter about keeping faith with the Constitution, I think is a core conservative principle. And the generation of conservatives needs to understand that we have an obligation to keep our oath, as the Bible says, even when it hurts. But, having written extensively about that in my autobiography, and your listeners can certainly go to Amazon.com or where all good books are sold if they want to read more about those days in my book, So Help Me God. I really wanted to write a book about the future going forward. And I want to call balls and strikes in this one. I think one of the things I've been encouraged about in the reviews about the book so far is that people have taken note of the fact that I've described the kind of the Democratic Party's collapse into the progressive left and even embracing socialism, questioning our long-term support for Israel, and even sometimes in dark and anti-Semitic terms. But I'm also given the new Trump administration credit where credit is due, and called out the embrace of the populist right, which is on foreign policy, reflecting some of those very same attitudes. There's something called the horseshoe theory, which I'm a big horse guy. We like to go take trail rides when we're out and about, and even here in Indiana. the horseshoe theory is that if you allow the progressive left and the populist right to stay on the same track, they'll eventually meet like a horseshoe does. And you do see that in attitudes toward Israel, in some of the harsh and darker rhetoric that's been tolerated by the so-called new right and progressive left, that takes the shape of anti-Semitism, and I would say the embrace of policies like nationalization of businesses. Gary, when the administration came out, I think it was with U.S. Steel, and which is got a big footprint in Indiana. To me, that was a no-brainer. Japan's one of our closest allies in the world, and the ability to purchase U.S. Steel and grow those jobs. Finally found a way to get it done. But when I heard that the federal government was going to take shares, so-called golden shares, in the New Deal with Nippon, Elizabeth Warren actually said of nationalization of business, she said, quote, it's in my book, she said, quote, Donald Trump has come across an idea that I came up with years ago. And as I said on a lot of stops in the last week, actually, with all due respect to Senator Elizabeth Warren, she didn't come up with that idea of, the government nationalizing private enterprise. Karl Marx did, but this is part of that horseshoe theory where you see both sides coming together, and it's not what conservatives believe, and it's big inspiration in my book.
Do you think the Republican Party is really at an inflection point right now?
I think so. I really do believe. Look, I know the president better than his most ardent defenders, right? As I said, we had a close working relationship for 4.5 years, and he is not ideological. I actually, in the book, which I hope a lot of your listeners will grab, I actually found some quotes where he said what he said to me innumerable times, where he said, I'm not a conservative. And he's never claimed to be, in all fairness. I would be in meetings with the president and, trying to add value to his deliberations. I would say, well, that's the conservative position. And he'd always, with a wave of a hand, say, it's a common sense. He bristled at being called a conservative. A great respect for conservative voters and conservative principles and values, but he never said that's what he was, and I try and be fair about that in the book. But what's happening, though, and I want people to understand on my side of the aisle, is that the populist right is trying to take some of these departures from traditional conservative agenda, that depart from economic freedom, that depart from America's role as leader of the free world, even marginalized values like the right to life. And they want to make that now the agenda of the Republican Party. And I think that has great political risk. But more important than that, Gary, you know me well enough to know, I believe these are the things that make America strong and prosperous and free, to strengthen our families, keep our country secure, create boundless economic growth. So we've got to have a conservative party in America, and I'm going to continue to fight for that.
You mentioned U.S. Steel earlier and its presence in Northwest Indiana. Curious of your thoughts about Northwest Indiana. It seems to be, a part of the state, a region that has had more than its share of challenges over the decades, but really seems to, have its feet under it right now. A lot of momentum in Northwest Indiana, the expansion of the South Shore and improvements in communities. Now this Bears deal, the potential for that as well. The importance of Northwest Indiana to the state of Indiana, Northwest Indiana doing well.
Well, just, the heartbreak of the drawdown of U.S. Steel's commitment to the region years ago, it just shattered the broader economy. But I would say, and I'm proud to have been some part of now several decades of Republican conservative leadership in Indiana, has really created the conditions where Northwest Indiana is one of the most exciting growth areas in the Midwest today. I would put it on par with Central Indiana. I'd put it on par with New Albany and all the incredible growth that's happened down there. You write those stories and do a great job. I don't want to leave Fort Wayne out. Fort Wayne is just such a dynamic community and growth. But I think it just proves that economic freedom works. that businesses want to be in an environment that is predictable, states that balance budgets and have budget surpluses reflected in a AAA bond rating. That's an environment where a business can come in with confidence about what their costs are going to be, not next year, but in 5 years and in 10 years. And, but I don't wish Chicago ill. My parents both grew up on the south side of Chicago. All my grandparents are buried there. I love Chicago, and we've got to see Chicago come back. But iron sharpens iron, as the Bible says. My hope is that as Indiana continues to prosper, Northwest Indiana continues to abound, that the people of Illinois, the people of Chicago might actually decide that they need to take a different course.
Yeah, as you look, Mike, at the future for Indiana, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, now microelectronics and more new economy type investments happening here. Where do you see the state's future, and how do you feel about the future of the Indiana economy?
I think it's a rocket ship that, so long as we stay on the solid foundation of economic freedom we've been on, and those mainstream conservative principles of living within our means and letting businesses keep more of what they earn, keeping a tight rein on government regulation. You take 3 steps back, and Indiana's just going to continue to abound. I will tell you, I'll never forget, Gary, the day that we had some folks come in my office at the State House. I was still pretty new in the governor's office, and they said, "We've got this idea for something called the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. Wondered if you could go to the legislature and see if we could find $10 million to stake it." And I immediately was drawn to the idea, as tight-fisted conservative as I am. We got with the General Assembly. They bought into it, which never an easy sale with the General Assembly. But just, after we moved home, it was probably about a year and a half ago, Randy Tobias, a great friend, former chairman, CEO of Eli Lilly, who was a driving force behind the success of that company, and his successors done brilliantly as well. But he was the guy that had this vision for, let's be about life sciences in India. Randy and I went and walked through the biosciences, seeing the One Health, seeing the expansion of Elanco downtown. It's incredibly exciting, and Frank, it's just very humbling.
Yeah,
To feel like in some small way we were able to be a part of something that I think Indiana is already known for around the country and around the world, but I think we've only just begun.
you mentioned the Elanco expansion downtown, the corporate headquarters, and a number of things happening downtown in Indianapolis. What can not just Indianapolis, but Indiana, in your view, do better or do more of to attract and keep more young talent in the state? Obviously, population growth is an important issue for all states, including Indiana. What does Indiana need to do to better attract and retain talent?
That's a hard question to answer because we Karen and I we got 5 acres and a pond out here near Zionsville, but I just saw again that Carmel was named the best place in America to live. I talk to young professionals all the time who love this city, love our great sports traditions. I think maybe what we could do better is just tell our story, that Indiana is just, I literally think it's one of the best places in America to live, to work, to raise a family, and retire. I think, but at Hoosiers, we're instinctively kind of a modest group. We don't generally toot our own horn, but I think we could do a bit more of that, because I literally, as I travel the country on this book tour, and as have traveled over the last 5 years, people with a shake of a head, particularly when I'm in Democrat-led states, will go, "Man, you guys in Indiana have got it going." So those jobs opportunities, educational opportunities for families, the way we've led on school choice, I think we're there. We just need to tell our story a little better.
Yeah. Do you think, in terms of an inflection point, Midwest states like Indiana have an opportunity now, as companies are looking at policies, business economic policies on the coasts and some other places, increasingly are looking at states like Indiana in the Midwest as a place to invest because of cost of doing business and those types of things? Is this an opportunity for Indiana again to kind of light that rocket ship?
It's an immense opportunity, and also it's good for the nation. You know, I've got a chapter in the book on a new birth of federalism. You know, I love what Ronald Reagan said, that it's in his first inaugural address. He said, it's important to remember the states created the federal government. The federal government didn't create the states. And there's a picture, it's behind me on my bookshelf in my study here in Zionsville of Reagan speaking to the Indiana General Assembly. I think it was in 1982, where he canvassed the country. He said it's our objective to send policies and flexibility back to the states. I'm pleased. In many respects, we did that during the Trump-Pence years. We granted more waivers to states on implementing federal policies, whether it's healthcare or labor, of any recent administration. And on energy, I see the administration particularly doing that again. But I do think that Indiana is one of those states that is demonstrating the vitality of economic freedom, educational freedom, and that has the ability really to create the kind of competition that exists between the states that'll lift the whole country.
Mike, as we wrap up, looking forward, what role do you want to play in public life going forward? You're obviously continuing to be very visible in promoting conservatism. What's next for Mike Pence?
Well, you know, I'm a man of faith. I mean, my life is not my own, but I don't see returning to active politics. I love that Luke Combs song that says, I think I rode that rocket about as far as it'll fly. But, you know, what drew me to the Republican Party was these principles, Gary. I was a young Democrat in Columbus, Indiana, knocking on doors, canvassing for candidates. But when I heard Ronald Reagan talking about strong national defense, limited government, traditional moral values, I joined the Reagan Revolution and never looked back. And I think, my ambition today, whether it's this book or my foundation in Washington, D.C., called Advancing American Freedom Foundation, we want to be a voice. We want to advocate for the principles that haven't just defined the Republican Party the last 50 years, but I think they've created freedom and prosperity and security for the American people. And so we'll let the future take care of itself. But that's what Karen and I feel called to do in the time that we have available between our 5 grandchildren, and trying to make sure that we spoiling them rotten, and also, just what a blessing it is these last 5 years to be back home again in Indiana. It wasn't our original plan, but I have to tell you, jumping in my pickup truck, driving over to the Kroger's, cheering on the Colts, just enjoying life here in Indiana. It's been a gift from God to us. So,
well, really do appreciate, Mike, you taking the time to join me on the podcast. The book is What Conservatives Believe, Rediscovering the Conservative Conscience. And I know you're off to another destination to promote that book right now and all that you do. But do appreciate you taking the time, Mike. Always great to catch up with you. Appreciate your public service, your continued public service for Indiana and the nation, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Gary. Congratulations on all your success, and thanks for having me on the program.
All right. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. We are a weekly conversation with achievers in business, sports, entertainment, and beyond. And you can download all of our episodes and get Indiana business news 24/7. All you have to do is go to InsideIndianaBusiness.com. I'm Gary Dick. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.